welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I'm Jessica. I am your host today, and I am here with an author who wrote a absolutely lovely, lovely book, and I cannot wait to start recommending it to people. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about the JINN Daughter?
Sure. So I'm Rania Hanna. I'm the author of The JINN Daughter. And The JINN Daughter is a Middle Eastern folklore and fantasy that is based on a Hakawati or storytelling jinn whose job it is to tell the stories of the dead so they can pass on to the final gate in the afterlife so that they have everlasting peace. And as she does so, what she does is that she eats the souls of the dead in the form of pomegranate seeds. She also is a mother. She has a young daughter Layala, who she's 13. She's 13, 14, starting to go through her rebellious independence, I want to do what I want to do phase, which her mother, is trying to navigate. And part of all of this is that Nadine, who's the Hakawati Jinn, I probably should have introduced her earlier by her name, but she has death magic, which makes sense as she tells the stories of the dead. And part of this is that when Layala was a baby, she actually died and her mother resurrected her. So now Layala is touched by death magic. This comes into play later when the goddess of death wants Layala to take over as the new goddess of death. So, of course, the two are dueling and really trying to each get what they want, which is Layala. There's also a backdrop of the Jinn Wars where humans have fought jinns so that they can gain their power, really reducing the population of jinns. And so Nadine, who is a jinn, lives in the woods in the outskirts of the village. So there's kind of this Scarlet Letter feel going on because she's so ostracized by a society, her and her daughter. But she's trying to navigate that. All while Layala's father, who is Nadine's love of her life, is actually dead, but not dead. So he's actually in the afterlife. He comes to visit them, but, there are lots of restrictions, lots of parameters around that. And so there's a lot of grief, and the story ultimately is really a story about grief and acceptance in your life.
So it was gorgeous. It really puts you into the feel of like a story and a folktale. It really felt like a folktale. In fact, there were several times I was like trying to see, I'm like, is this based on like an actual folktale? I mean, it was really just so so nicely written in that tone. So yeah, you're welcome. No, it was really great. I can't stress that enough. What drew you to this story? This is your debut novel. What was it about these characters in this story that really got you going and weaving this tale?
Yeah, it started right after I read Tahara Mafi. She's a Persian author. I read Witchwood, which was this story about this, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, but this girl who's like a corpse washer and she deals with the dead, and this idea of passing on the dead and taking care of the dead and kind of being that caretaker really stuck with me. I think partially because the first book I ever read that was fantasy that got me into fantasy as a teenager was Sabriel by Garth Nix. Love that book. Yes, absolutely love it.
Much redefined what this is the wildest thing I've said today so far. Redefined how I look at necromancy.
Really,
that whole series, because as a D&D player, my life, late to life D&D player. I started in my 20s, but like necromancy is somebody doing dark deeds and raising the dead, and there is some of that in Sabriel, but there is also a very nurturing aspect to it. And just the way that Garth Nix sort of set up what he considers, like the dead, how there's different gates and different bells. I absolutely was enthralled in that world. And every time he came out with another book in that world, I just devoured it. So
Same,
I
same.
see it. I see it in here.
Yep, I
Yeah.
absolutely love that entire series, Old Kingdom series, one of my favorite fantasy books. I remember rereading them as a teenager. They were so good. And I really love this idea of, as you're saying, nurturing aspect of death and taking care of the dead and being the caretaker. So that whole mix of ideas really started brewing, and I went and sat down and started writing. And I really didn't know where this was going to go. I honestly thought the story would be centered on Nayala, and Nadine just kind of took center stage there, and it became her story, and I kind of just ran with it. And a large part of it is this, like you're mentioning, this folk tale, folkloric aspect. It's really coming from I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Syrian. We have a strong tradition of oral storytelling. My dad, I grew up being told stories. Like, he didn't read me stories, he really just told me stories that he remembered growing up, or stories I think he would make up. And so there's a strong aspect there of this oral storytelling that I really wanted to weave into the larger narrative. And that's kind of all of these concepts kind of came together and became the Jinn Daughter.
So a few other things I wanted to talk about. First of all, I love that you talk about Nadine sort of taking the story herself, and I feel like that's always the mark of just sort of a good character who sort of wrestles with the writer for the pen
Yes.
and is like, listen, we know that the heart of the story is Loyala, but I'm the one who is, I'm the one who the story is really going to be driven by.
Exactly.
And I felt that from her. You got a lot of that from her. She was a very strong character, and she was put in impossible situations, which I think is a really good way to sort of go with like fairy tales, especially with a mother. Like, the mother's always dead, and I suppose in a weird way, yes, in this particular case, but
Mhm.
also not. In fairy tales, like, as opposed to a dead mother or a stepmother, this is a mother with magic that's really trying to save the daughter.
Mhm.
So some of the mythology, and the stories that are told, um, did they come from anywhere, or were they sort of just driven by the narrative of the Jinn Daughter?
I would say kind of a mix, but mostly it comes from Arab folklore, really. Like, jinns obviously are very Middle Eastern. That I did not come up with. The idea of a Hakawati, or a storytelling jinn, actually comes from a tradition of the Hakawati. Like, in Syrian culture, Hakawati is the storyteller. So, like in Damascus, there is, I think it's like the oldest coffee house in Damascus, actually has the Hakawati, these old men who carry these stories and they go and tell them orally to a crowd. So that aspect really just came about from my culture. So a lot, I say, really comes directly from Arab culture, Arab folklore, Arab mythology, just the Arab way, Arab traditions. Like, it's very just rich in Middle Eastern tradition, which I was very adamant about wanting in there. I think we don't have enough of that in literature, and I want to see more of that. I want to see more of our culture shine in a way that I had growing up. And so I think that all of that really mixed together into Jinn Daughter.
The book talks a bit about, I believe, like Jinn wars, am I
Hmm.
correct? And just different types of Jinn, um, which was lovely, lovely to read about. Is there mythology behind that, or was that just sort of a background, like a backdrop to this story as well?
It was more of a backdrop. I did want to bring in the idea about one group of people who persecute another group of people for what they have. In this case, it was humans persecuting jinns for having magic. And it kind of came about from, your typical like Aladdin, three wishes, wants everything, so forth. So that kind of played into it a little bit, but really it was just a backdrop for the narrative to explain why Nadine was so ostracized by society and why it was so difficult for her to survive in this society that really just wanted everything possible they can get out of her, which is managing the dead for them, but who really wanted to have nothing to do with her anyway. Right. And so I really hope in future books, like if I can write one that's kind of a prequel that focuses on the jinn, where I've actually been thinking about that.
Do it.
Yeah.
Do it.
I've definitely been thinking about it. I have some ideas, but not sure where that'll go yet. We'll see.
I would 100% read that.
Thank you.
That's like one of my favorite things in books, and to talk to writers about, is just how the groundwork for a story and the build up and the backdrop sort of leads to more in the future. So I would 100% read about that.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll write it.
Another thing I wanted to ask you, there's a few things, obviously. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but within the stories that Nadine tells, there's there's a forbidden love story. There is also when you talk about, when she's eating the souls of the dead, she's eating pomegranate mythology. A lot of us, our first sort of introduction to pomegranate mythology involving the dead is the Hades Persephone story. I mean, forgive me for sounding ignorant. Is the origin in Arab mythology?
Honestly, I don't know. I actually didn't know about the Persephone pomegranate connection until after I wrote Jinn Daughter.
Wow,
Actually,
that's amazing.
yeah, I only recently learned about it. I did know about pomegranates being the symbol of immortality and death. I don't know how I knew this. It must have been something in my
It's something
childhood.
magical that brought you to it. I mean, they are very interesting fruits.
Yeah.
And I've been a Greek mythology person forever, and that was always one of my favorites. But when you see like a little pomegranate seed, it is sort of like life in a seed. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, and it's bitter, but it's got a little bit of sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand how people might be eating it, and it might seem really magical to them, but it kind of just sort of came to me because I know a lot of times um, myth travels and transforms. And there's a lot of things that I've learned, have ended up in other myths, but began in, obviously the Middle East. So I was very curious about that, but it works so well in the story, and it really does feel like a pomegranate seed could be the soul of the dead. Which, by the way, the cover of the book is also gorgeous and features pomegranates.
Thank you.
So,
Yes, thank you.
yeah, yeah. I also wanted to ask about some of the other characters. Rami was a really interesting character,
Yes.
and there were so many things I was not expecting from that character. Um, did he always have a role to play in the story, or did he sort of show up on Nadine's doorstep the way that he did in the book, like while you were writing her?
Yeah, I don't think I really expected him. I remember when I thought, that's interesting. I have a new character. I need to find a name. And I just kind of picked one out of thin air. Wasn't sure where it was going to go. And I really wasn't sure if he was going to be a good or bad character morally. I initially thought he was going to be a lot more villainous. And then I thought, well, actually, I think he has some goodness in him. And I went back and forth really. And kind of like Nadine, at some point, I just kind of had to let go and think, this is their story to tell. I'm just the channel for them. And he became his own character. And the more I learned about him and recognized that I don't know if he's either good or bad. I think he's just selfish, which we all are. I don't think there's anything unique in that regard with him. I think he's a very much a person in pain, and he reacts accordingly in ways that I think kind of makes sense if you recognize that it's pain and grief that's driving him, which I think for every character, that's kind of what's driving them is pain and grief, but they're reacting in totally different ways, and they're interacting with each other in different ways based on that pain and grief.
And then you have Kamuna, who
Hmm.
another very interesting character who I suppose is basically death personified.
Hmm.
Um, Once again, just another sort of another just really well written character, which was in the story and brought new dimension um, to it. I think like there's just so many layers to again that the different types of death. Like there's the nurturing, there's the personification, and it all just really led to a really nice tapestry. And
Thank you.
I liked it. It was really good. And this is your first book.
It's the first one that's getting published. I've been writing for years. I have so many dead manuscripts. So this is the first one that has actually been brought to life in a very tangible way.
How did you get to publishing? You say says you have a few books in the drawer, obviously. How did this one get picked up?
This was the one that I got an agent for. I mean, I have pitched in the past, I've queried in the past for other manuscripts. I got a lot. I was rejected every single time, but it was a lot of like, your ideas are really great. You need work. The technical aspects of writing needs work. I was actually looking for an editor for JINN Daughter um, way back when, and happened to stumble across my agent who does editing as well. And I just happened to message her and said, would you be willing to edit my manuscript? And she was. And in reading it, she decided that instead of being the editor, she wanted to be the agent. And that's how it was picked up. But yeah, I mean, I was rejected so many times, including for JINN Daughter. I think I probably queried 80 to 100 and got maybe 2 or 3 that wanted to represent me, and that was it. So it's definitely a numbers game, and this was the one that made it.
Thank you so much. This was really good. This is due out on shelves in April.
Yes, April 2nd.
Well, it is lovely. I think people are really going to like it. You got a blurb from Helene Wicker, who wrote
Yes.
the
Yep.
Gollum and the Ginny, which was another really
Phenomenal.
good one. That must have been like really surreal for you to be like,
It
oh,
was. It's actually one of my favorite books. I was so surprised when we got that blurb. I love her writing. She is a phenomenal writer. If anyone hasn't read her books, definitely go check them out. They are beautifully written.
well, you are in good company. And we are looking forward to what is coming next from you. I definitely want to read that Gin Wars book. Just
I will let you know when it's out if I ever write it.
putting it into the universe.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rania Hanna. This is Jessica from Syosset Public Library, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.